The shrill wailing of air raid sirens ripped through the night, shattering the silence over Berlin. Lieutenant Rudolf Jaeger grabbed his helmet and sprinted toward the hospital wing, his boots echoing across the concrete floor. The Allied bombing had become relentless these past weeks, punishment for Germany's sins, some whispered when officers weren't listening. "Get them to the shelter!" Rudolf shouted to the nurses as he burst through the doors. The ward erupted in controlled chaos as medical staff began moving patients. Some men screamed, their wounds still fresh from the Eastern Front. Others stared silently at the ceiling, already lost to something worse than death. Rudolf helped a young private with a bandaged chest onto a stretcher. He'd been here 3 months, overseeing the hospital's security, watching German boys arrive broken and depart either healed or in pine boxes. The distant thump of bombs drew closer. "Lieutenant, we can't move all of them," Sister Helga said, her face tight with worry. "The critical cases in the back ward, I'll stay with them," he replied firmly. "Get the others down." She nodded and hurried away. Rudolf made his way to the isolation ward where the most severely wounded lay. His job was to protect these men, what remained of the WWII's fighting strength. This was his duty. In war, duty was all that mattered, the only anchor in a world coming apart. The walls trembled as he entered the darkened room. 6 beds, 6 broken men. Rudolf checked each patient, adjusting oxygen tubes and 4 lines that might be disturbed by the bombing. His father, a decorated officer from the Great War, had taught him that duty transcended everything: comfort, desire, fear. Even compassion was secondary to obligation. Love is a wartime liability, Rudolf, his father had told him after his mother died. It makes men weak when they need to be strong. He had lived by those words, rising through the ranks with machine-like efficiency, keeping everyone at a safe distance. The bombing intensified, and plaster dust rained from the ceiling. Rudolf crouched beside the last bed, where a soldier no older than 20 lay unconscious, his face half covered in bandages. The floor buckled beneath his feet. A deafening explosion tore through the west wing, and the lights flickered out. In the darkness, Rudolf heard glass shattering and the ominous crack of support beams. He dove over the patient as the ceiling partially collapsed, feeling a sharp pain across his back as debris struck him. When the dust settled, Rudolf found himself in semi-darkness, the room transformed into a jagged landscape of broken furniture and fallen beams. The exit was blocked. He checked the patients, 3 were now buried under rubble, beyond help. The others needed immediate evacuation. Rudolf tried his radio. Dead. He was trapped with 3 critically wounded men and no way to call for help. A soft moan came from the corner of the room, where a section of the wall had collapsed, revealing what appeared to be another ward, one Rudolf hadn't known existed. He picked his way through the debris, following the sound. Behind the fallen wall, a woman in a white nurse's uniform was pinned beneath a wooden beam. Her face was streaked with dust and blood, but her eyes were alert, intelligent. She stared at him in terror. "Don't move," he said in German, kneeling beside her. "I'll get this off you." The woman's response made Rudolf freeze. "Please," she whispered in perfect English. "Don't hurt me." Rudolf stared at her, his mind racing. An English speaker. Here, in a restricted military hospital in Berlin. He reached for his sidearm instinctively, then stopped. Her white uniform bore no insignia, and the room behind her contained medical supplies and what looked like files. "Who are you?" he demanded, switching to English. "Nurse," she managed, wincing in pain. "Beatrice Keller." "You're lying," Rudolf said coldly. "American?" "British spy." "British nurse," she replied, her breath coming in short gasps. "Captured at Dunkirk." They brought me here to treat special prisoners. Rudolf's eyes narrowed. Special prisoners? Allied pilots? Scientists? He had heard rumors of a separate facility within the complex for high-value captives, but his clearance hadn't extended to those areas. The building shuddered with another nearby explosion. Dust showered down from what remained of the ceiling. "Please," Beatrice said, her voice steadier now. "There are wounded men in there who will die without help." Rudolf stood motionless, training and duty warring within him. An enemy nurse. Possibly a spy. Protocol demanded he secure her as a prisoner and report her immediately. But they were trapped. His patients were dying. And beyond the collapsed wall were more wounded who needed care. "If I free you, will you help my men?" he asked finally. Surprise flickered across her face. "Yes." Rudolf braced himself against the beam and lifted. Beatrice pulled herself free, wincing as she tested her leg. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded. "It's just bruised." "The patients." "Mine first," Rudolf insisted, leading her to the German soldiers. "Then we'll see about yours." For the next hour, as bombs fell around them, they worked in tense silence, stabilizing the wounded. Rudolf watched the British nurse care for German soldiers with the same gentle efficiency she might have shown her own countrymen. Her hands never hesitated, her focus never wavered. When she spoke to the conscious patients, her German was heavily accented but comprehensible, offering comfort with simple words. When they had done all they could for the German wounded, Rudolf followed her through the gap in the wall. In the small ward beyond, he found 3 Allied airmen, all severely injured. "Shot down last week," Beatrice explained quietly. "They're keeping them alive for interrogation." Rudolf stood rigid, facing enemy combatants who had likely dropped bombs on German cities, perhaps even on his own family in Dresden. These were men he was trained to hate. "They need water," Beatrice said, interrupting his thoughts. "The supply line to this room must have been damaged." Rudolf hesitated only briefly before retrieving his canteen. "Here." Beatrice looked at him with an expression he couldn't interpret, not quite gratitude, not quite surprise, but something that made him uncomfortable all the same. She helped an American sergeant drink, supporting his head gently. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'm a doctor first," he replied stiffly, though he had never articulated this thought before. "Before I'm a soldier." They worked side by side through the night as the bombing raid eventually subsided. Somewhere near dawn, they heard voices and the sound of rescue crews clearing debris. Rudolf suddenly realized the precariousness of their situation. "They can't find you here," he said urgently. "They'll think you were trying to escape." "I wasn't," Beatrice said, straightening. "I was doing my job." "They won't care." He glanced around frantically, then spotted a small storage closet. "In there." "Quickly." Beatrice hesitated, then ducked inside just as German voices grew louder. Rudolf closed the door and turned to face the rescue crew breaking through. Hours later, after the patients had been evacuated and Rudolf had been treated for minor injuries, he found himself standing outside the commandant's office, his uniform as neat as he could manage under the circumstances. He had reported everything about the night, except for Nurse Keller. The lie of omission weighed on him. Rudolf had never violated protocol, never failed in his duty. But something about the British nurse's dedication to her patients, even her enemies, had stirred something he thought long buried, a recognition that humanity could persist even in the depths of war. That night, using his authority as hospital security officer, Rudolf returned to the damaged wing, now cordoned off for repairs. He found the storage closet empty. Had she been discovered? Escaped? The thought troubled him more than it should have. A folded piece of paper lay on the shelf. Inside, in neat handwriting, "Thank you for your mercy. I won't forget." 3 days later, Rudolf was summoned to oversee the transfer of prisoners to a more secure facility outside Berlin. Among them was Beatrice Keller. Their eyes met briefly as she boarded the transport truck, her face expressionless. Rudolf maintained his rigid posture, revealing nothing to the guards around him. That night, he requested assignment to the new facility, citing security concerns about the Allied prisoners. His superior officer granted the transfer without question. Rudolf's record was impeccable. At the Hohenzollern Castle facility, converted to a prison hospital, Rudolf found himself increasingly drawn to the wing where Allied medical personnel were housed separately from combat prisoners. He began regular inspections, telling himself it was proper security protocol. During these inspections, he would inevitably encounter Nurse Keller. Their exchanges were formal, brief, a question about medical supplies, a report on a patient's condition. But something indefinable passed between them each time. A current of recognition, perhaps. Two people maintaining humanity in inhuman circumstances. One evening in late autumn, Rudolf found Beatrice alone in the supply room, inventorying medications. "The new patients from Normandy will arrive tomorrow," he said, closing the door behind him. 20 of them. Mostly burn cases. Beatrice nodded. "We'll need more morphine." "I've authorized it," he replied, then hesitated. "Why did you become a nurse?" The question surprised them both. It was the first personal inquiry either had ventured. Beatrice looked at him curiously. "My brother died of pneumonia when I was 12. The nurses were so kind to him, to us. I wanted to be like them." She paused. "And you?" "Why medicine?" "My father wanted a military man," Rudolf said carefully. "I wanted to heal." This was the compromise. A small smile touched her lips, the first he had seen. A compromise that serves both sides well. Rudolf found himself smiling in return. "Yes, I suppose it does." Their conversation was interrupted by footsteps in the corridor. Rudolf quickly opened a medical cabinet, pretending to inspect it as another officer passed the door. These moments multiplied over the weeks that followed, brief, hidden conversations in supply rooms and empty corridors. They spoke of their training, their homes before the war, books they had read. Never politics, never the fighting. It was as if they had silently agreed to create a small neutral territory between them, where the war could not intrude. December brought heavy snow and news of German retreats on both fronts. The mood among the officers darkened, discipline tightened. Rudolf found it increasingly difficult to engineer moments alone with Beatrice, but somehow they managed, a shared glance across the ward, a brushing of fingers as medical charts were exchanged, a whispered word in passing. Rudolf began to recognize the dangerous shift in his feelings. This was no longer professional curiosity or even forbidden friendship. He thought of her when they were apart, worried for her safety, found himself making small adjustments to her work assignments to ease her burden. Each small act of protection was a betrayal of his duty, yet he could not stop himself. On Christmas Eve, Rudolf was assigned night duty. The castle was eerily quiet, most officers having gone to a celebration in the nearby town. He made his rounds and found himself outside the small chapel where Allied medical personnel were permitted to gather for prayer. Inside, Beatrice sat alone in the dim light of a single candle, her head bowed. Rudolf hesitated, then entered, closing the door softly behind him. "You should have gone to town with the others," she said without turning. "I volunteered to stay." He sat beside her, maintaining a proper distance. "What are you praying for?" Peace, she answered simply. Family. Home. She turned to look at him, her face soft in the candlelight. What would you pray for if you still believed in prayer? The question pierced him. I don't know anymore, he admitted. The things I once believed in seem distant now. Like what? Duty. Honor. Victory. He looked at his hands. They taught us the enemy was inhuman. That compassion was weakness. And now? Now I see that those were lies. Rudolf's voice dropped to a whisper. You care for German soldiers with the same hands that tend to your countrymen. Where is the enemy in that? Beatrice's eyes shone in the dim light. Perhaps the real enemy is the hatred they've taught us, not each other. Rudolf felt something break open inside him, a truth he had been avoiding for months. Beatrice, The chapel door opened abruptly. Captain Werner Hoffmann stood in the doorway, his face hardening as he took in the scene. Lieutenant Jaeger, he said coldly. A word outside. Rudolf rose stiffly, his face carefully composed. Outside the chapel, Hoffmann's eyes were like ice. Fraternizing with prisoners is treason, Jaeger. I was conducting a security check, sir, Rudolf replied evenly. Making sure protocols were observed during religious services. Is that why you were sitting beside her? Speaking in intimate tones. Hoffmann's voice was dangerously quiet. I've been watching you, Jaeger. The way you look at the British nurse. The special attention. Rudolf felt cold fear spread through him. Not for himself, but for Beatrice. Sir, I assure you, you're relieved of duty, effective immediately, Hoffmann snapped. Report to Major Keller's office at 0800 tomorrow. I'm recommending disciplinary action. After Hoffmann strode away, Rudolf stood frozen in the corridor, his mind racing. Disciplinary action could mean anything from demotion to court-martial, or worse, if they suspected the depth of his feelings for Beatrice. And what would happen to her? He returned to his quarters and sat on his bed, head in his hands. His father's voice echoed in his memory, love is a wartime liability. How right he had been. Rudolf had compromised everything, his duty, his oath, his safety, for feelings he shouldn't have allowed to develop. A soft knock at his door jolted him from his thoughts. He opened it to find Nurse Helga, her expression grave. They're transferring the British nurse tomorrow, she whispered. To a camp in the east. Rudolf felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath him. The eastern camps were notorious. Few returned. Why, he managed. Hoffmann claims she was caught attempting to steal medications. Everyone knows it's a lie, but... Helga shrugged helplessly. Be careful, Rudolf. They're watching you too. After she left, Rudolf paced his small room like a caged animal. The sensible course was clear: distance himself immediately, denounce any connection, save his career and possibly his life. The war was going poorly for Germany, this was no time to risk everything for an enemy nurse. Yet as night deepened, he found himself putting on his coat and making his way to the secure wing where Allied medical personnel were quartered. The guard on duty was young Private Müller, who idolized Rudolf and often sought his advice. So? Müller straightened as Rudolf approached. At ease, Private. I need to conduct a final security check before tomorrow's transfer. Captain Hoffmann's orders. Müller hesitated only briefly before unlocking the door. Of course, sir. How long will you need? 15 minutes should suffice, Rudolf said calmly, though his heart was pounding. Wait here. Inside the darkened dormitory, Rudolf moved quietly past sleeping forms until he reached Beatrice's bed. He touched her shoulder gently. She woke instantly, eyes widening in alarm when she saw him. "Come," he whispered. "We haven't much time." She followed him to a small storage alcove off the main room. "They're sending you east tomorrow," he said without preamble. "Hoffman has made accusations." In the dim light, he saw her face pale. "Because of us?" "Yes." Rudolf took a deep breath. "I have access to supply trucks leaving for the Western Front at dawn. I can hide you in one. When they reach the forward aid station near the Luxembourg border, you might find a way to reach Allied lines." Beatrice stared at him. "You do that?" "Risk everything." "I already have," he replied simply. She reached out, touching his face with gentle fingers. "Come with me." The words hung between them, impossible and tempting. "I can't," he said finally. "If we both disappear, they'll hunt us more intensely. And there are other Allied prisoners here who need protection. Someone who will look the other way sometimes, provide extra rations when possible." Tears filled her eyes. "When did you become this person, Rudolf? This man who would risk his life for an enemy?" "When I stopped seeing you as an enemy," he answered. "When I started seeing you as just you." They stood in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down upon them. "If I agree to go," Beatrice said finally, "you must promise me something." "Anything." "When the war ends, and it will end, Rudolf, meet me. No matter how long it takes, no matter what happens. In London, at St. Thomas Hospital, where I trained. On the first day of peace." Rudolf took her hands in his. "I promise. When this war ends, I will find you." Before dawn, dressed in a German nurse's uniform with papers identifying her as Helena Schmidt, Beatrice was hidden in a supply truck bound for the Western Front. Rudolf had risked everything to arrange it, bribing the driver, falsifying transfer orders, creating a medical emergency that required immediate delivery of supplies. As the truck pulled away in the gray morning light, Rudolf stood at attention, ostensibly overseeing the supply transfer. His face revealed nothing, but inside, his heart was being torn in two. An hour later, he reported to Major Keller's office as ordered. The interrogation was brutal. Hoffman had reported his suspicions, though he lacked concrete evidence. Rudolf denied everything, maintaining his persona of the dedicated, by-the-book officer. When news of Nurse Keller's disappearance reached them midway through the meeting, Rudolf feigned appropriate shock and outrage. "I want her found," he declared convincingly. "Such a breach of security is unacceptable." The investigation that followed was intense but ultimately inconclusive. Rudolf was placed under observation but retained his position. Every day was a careful performance, every night filled with worry about Beatrice's fate. Had she made it to Allied lines? Was she safe? Would he ever know? Weeks turned to months. The war continued its grim progression, Germany's fortunes waning with each passing day. Rudolf threw himself into his work, caring for the wounded on both sides with renewed dedication. If he could not be with Beatrice, he could at least honor what she had taught him, that compassion was not weakness but strength. In April 1945, as Allied forces pushed deep into Germany, Rudolf was transferred to a field hospital near Berlin. The city was under constant bombardment, the government in chaos. Everyone knew the end was near. On a cold rainy night, as artillery fire lit the horizon, Rudolf sat in his quarters writing what might be his final letter, one he had no way to send but needed to write nonetheless. "My dearest Beatrice," it began. "I don't know if you are alive, if you made it to safety. I don't know if I will survive these final days to keep my promise. But I want you to know that meeting you changed everything. You showed me that humanity can survive even the worst we inflict upon each other. That love is not a liability but the only thing worth fighting for." The letter remained unfinished as air raid sirens wailed once more. Rudolf tucked it into his pocket and reported for duty. The hospital took a direct hit that night. Rudolf was pulled from the rubble with severe injuries. He woke in an American field hospital 2 days later. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. For 6 months, Rudolf recovered in Allied custody, first as a patient, then as a prisoner of war. His medical training earned him better treatment than most, allowed to assist in caring for other German prisoners. When finally classified as a non-threat and released, Europe was already deep into its difficult reconstruction. Rudolf made his way to London with single-minded determination, navigating the bureaucratic maze of displaced persons, travel restrictions, and lingering hostilities. It took him nearly a year to reach England, working odd jobs, using his medical skills to earn passage, sleeping in bombed-out buildings when necessary. On a crisp autumn morning in 1946, Rudolf stood before St. Thomas Hospital, his clothes worn but clean, his hair neatly combed. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times, yet now that it had arrived, he found himself paralyzed with doubt. What if she wasn't there? What if she had never made it to safety? Or worse, what if she had, but had changed her mind about a German doctor who had once been her enemy? The hospital bustled with activity, nurses and doctors hurrying past him as he stood motionless at the entrance. So many faces, none of them hers. Rudolf felt the weight of foolish hope crushing him. Of course she wouldn't be here. It had been almost 2 years. He turned to leave, his promise kept but his heart breaking, when a voice stopped him. "You're late." Rudolf turned slowly. Beatrice stood on the hospital steps, wearing a nurse's uniform, her hair shorter than he remembered but her eyes exactly the same. "The war ended 18 months ago," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion visible on her face. "There were complications," he replied, drinking in the sight of her. "I came as soon as I could." They stood looking at each other across the space of a few steps, the distance seeming both vast and insignificant compared to what they had already overcome. "Did you mean what you said?" Beatrice asked. "In your letter?" Rudolf looked confused. "My letter?" "I never sent, the unfinished one they found on you when you were injured," she explained. "An American chaplain forwarded it through the Red Cross. It took months to reach me." Rudolf remembered the letter he'd tucked into his pocket that final night, words written without hope of delivery. "Yes," he said simply. "Every word." Beatrice descended the steps until she stood before him. Around them, London continued rebuilding itself, people hurrying past with the determined energy of those who had survived the worst and were now focused on creating something new from the ruins. "It won't be easy," she said quietly. "There's still so much anger, so much grief." "I know," Rudolf replied. "But if we could find humanity in the middle of war, perhaps we can help others find it in peace." Beatrice smiled then, the full, radiant smile he had imagined during all the dark days of separation. She reached for his hand, and he took it, feeling the promise of a future neither of them had dared hope for. "Welcome home, Rudolf," she said softly. And although he stood in a foreign country, thousands of miles from where he had been born, Rudolf knew she was right. Home wasn't Germany or England. Home was wherever they faced the future together, two people who had found love across enemy lines and held on to it through the darkest hours of history. "Yes," he said, squeezing her hand gently as they turned toward the hospital doors. "I'm finally home."